Um, this is a funny question. Okay. It seems to be that the current rioters lack courtesy. Can you remark upon the dissolution of social formality and personal and collective restraint since around the year of your birth and its social consequences? I don't know. I don't think it was his intention, but it's funny. Like, back in Charles's day, the rioters had courtesy. They, they knew what it meant to be polite.
I don't remember that of any riot I've ever been in, frankly. I've read both Amy Vanderbilt and Emily Post, several editions of each, cover to cover, and I've never seen any advice on rioting. What the well-dressed rioter is wearing. When attending a riot, remember that while it is generally a casual event, a certain amount of formality lends a certain tone to the event. Well, I don't know what to tell you about that. I really don't. I don't know. Uh, back in the French Revolution, they had well-behaved mobs. About the only well-behaved mob I've ever heard of was the one going to burn down Frankenstein's castle. And they were all Hollywood extras anyway.
That's true, actually.
They were being paid.
Okay.
Kind of like some of the rioters today. Oh. Sorry, I can't be more helpful.
Okay, so you can't remark upon the dissolution of a social formality and personal and collective restraint since the year of your birth. And
that I can.
Okay, yeah.
That I can do. Sure. I can't help you with the whole riot stuff, but the rest of it I can.
Okay.
Yeah, there certainly has been a tremendous amount of that. Primarily, frankly, in the first 10 years of my life. Because, of course, that encompassed the hippie revolution. Everything since has been the ever-deepening impact of that era. There was a slight resurgence in the 80s of formality and behavior and all that, concurrent with the Reagan years. But it was kind of a last hurrah in a way. But basically, I mean, I was taught, you stand up when a woman enters the room, you hold the door for her. If she leaves the table, you stand up. You hold the chair for her. But feminism went after that kind of thing, as putting women on a pedestal and this sort of drivel. You spoke respectfully to older people. You never called your parents by their first names. They were always mom and dad till the day you died. And even our parents' friends, if they were very close friends, we called them uncle and aunt. We never called them by their first name. There are still a small handful of people today that I call Mr. and Mrs., whom I've known all my life. My sixth grade teacher is still Mr. Tritta. Or Mr. T. That was one thing. Well, I usually call your mother. I usually call Mrs. F.
Yeah.
And that that was the way you showed affection, was by diminutives like that. But on a couple of rare occasions, when I've called your mom by her first name, it just doesn't feel right.
And I've never even heard that. I don't even remember you doing that.
No, I'm not comfortable with it. Yeah. And it doesn't help that she had the same name as my mom.
Yeah.
And I would never dream of calling my mother. And my Aunt Jenny, who just died, was my aunt to the end of her life. I would never have dreamed of calling her Jenny. The funny thing about that, just parenthetically, is that back in 2016, my brother and I took my nephew Albert out to Connecticut to meet Aunt Jenny, whom we had never met before. And he was very amused, as he said afterwards, to see how this little old lady turned his father and uncle into tiny children.
Yeah.
But it's true. It was yes, auntie, no, auntie. And certainly, I do insist for my nephews and nieces that they call me uncle. and the same with the children of my friends. I I never let them call me by my first name.
Hmm. Oh,
Um, but the same is true with dinners and all that. I mean, if there's anything that drives me crazy, it's people eating with their mouths open. You know,
oh,
like
yeah.
a cow chewing its cud.
Yeah, that bothers me.
If I wanted to see the food in your mouth, I'd tell you. And the other thing too is that because of the growth in technology and so forth, and everyone's self-absorption on the internet, we've lost dining together. And before that, it was with television. One thing my dad always insisted on was that we had dinner as a family, and that how many families do that anymore? And when you don't do that, what you end up with is a home that becomes like a boarding house. There's no real relationship there. I think I mentioned last time that one reason why it is I forced myself to learn to read, was that when an issue of American Heritage would come in, my parents and my brother would talk about it around the dinner table, and I was stuck sitting there like an idiot, which I did not appreciate. So these are seemingly minor things, but they're not. I mean, another thing too, people often make fun of using various forks and all that at dinners, at formal settings. But you see, the reason for that is to make everything clear and apparent and quick. You see, if you've got a different set of utensils for each course, when you finish, you put them on the plate and off they go. They're not just lying there sloppy and all that. And there are a ton of other things. I mean, one of the things I was taught to do if I was eating out, you know how if you've got in fact, this happened to me today at lunch with the delicious sauerbraten I had at the Cafe Vess. There was this delicious pork and garlic gravy that was left over, and I was like a quarter of an inch on the plate. What do you do?
Get a piece of bread and mop it up, and then eat the bread.
Indeed.
I know
But
how
what
this
do you
goes.
do with that
Yeah.
bread?
What do you do with the bread?
Yeah.
You eat it. What?
Well, of course you eat it, but how do you handle putting the bread into the gravy?
I don't know, actually.
You chop it up with a knife and fork, and then each piece with the bread. You see, instead of using your fingers to break up the bread and scush it all around, what you do is you drop the slice of bread on the plate, you chop it up with a knife and fork, and then you use the fork to spear and swoosh.
Interesting. Makes sense.
Well, yeah, and see, it makes it easy, and if everybody knows it, nobody's staring at the way you eat because there's nothing to stare at. See, that's the funny thing. People think that etiquette existed so that snooty people could feel good about themselves and that they were in on the deal and nobody else was. That's not true. Etiquette existed so that everyone would have common means of doing certain things and everyone would be comfortable and on the same level. And it's interesting that in those days gone by, and certainly before my birth, but not too long before, lower class people would do their best to emulate their betters in dress and behavior and all that. And of course, today would say, oh, that was phony. Yeah, well, the result is that today our masters attempt to look like proles and act and behave like them. Do you think that's any less phony? I'm one of the people. No, you're not one of the people, not with an $8 million income. You're not one of the people. Why do you pretend? Well, my roots are with the people. Well, all of our roots are bound up with each other thanks to DNA, but that doesn't mean anything at all. You're not setting a standard of behavior. You're not setting a standard of anything. All you're doing is collecting your money. I remember one of the first wealthy people I ever met kept a full staff of servants. And I asked him why that was, because he really didn't need it. And he said something interesting to me. He said, because if you've got my kind of money, you have an obligation to employ as many people as possible. Now, when he was young, that kind of living was standard for the wealthy. What happened, of course, was not just World War II victimizing multi-servant households, which incidentally was done by the Bureau of Wages and Prices very determinedly, as you'll read in Puritan's Empire. I go into great detail about it. But beyond that, the rise of technology after the war meant that you didn't have to employ somebody to do those jobs. I mean, you could, but why bother when you could take care of the dishwasher and the washing machine and all that yourself? And yet you're still a millionaire. So instead of a huge house in the country with a ton of servants and a townhouse ditto, you've got a little apartment in town that you can take care of in town on yourself. Maybe you've got a Guatemalan lady who comes in twice a week to do the dusting and stuff. And then as far as the house in the country, just go to a resort. Everything's taken care of. But you're still a multimillionaire. Your fortune, however, is not being used socially.
It's interesting.
Well, we're not supposed to think along these lines.
All right.
I mean, honestly, there was another good reason. I do talk about this in the book. There was another good reason for targeting multi-servant homes, and that is that people of that sort in local areas tended to have a lot of influence. So let's say, for instance, that the Franchinis had, and it was typical in a lot of countries, not just America, but let's say you had an estate out there in Norco, California. And the Franchini place, I mean, unlike the Tumbler House Tower, which is all business, the Franchini estate was just that. You've got stables, you've got a great house, you've got gardens, maybe there's some agricultural stuff on the side. So you employ maybe 150 people. Now, you don't just employ 150 people. There are stores that you deal with. There are all kinds of businesses that you do business with in the area around. Because keeping a place like that going requires a great deal of expenditure, and it requires a great deal of input from the local community. Well, you know what? Mr. Franchini has a lot of influence. Why? Just because he's the biggest thing in Norco, that's why. He's the one who makes it possible for all those stores to keep going. He employs 150 people directly, and they all have families. What would happen then if Mr. Franchini closed down his estate and moved away?
Everyone's out of a job.
Not everyone, but a lot of people, you bet. Now, the other thing, too, though, is that Mr. Franchini has a lot of political influence also. And one of the traits of our history is that kind of local influence has been from the very beginning slowly but surely eroded. People become more and more dependent on the media for their views rather than on local nabobs. But who determines what the media says? Most people you see, and with good reason, don't form their political views on the basis of personal knowledge because they don't have much. So they form it on the basis of people who they trust to know more than they do. Now, in the case of Mr. Franchini, well, you know, the boss travels all over the world. He was at university. He must know what he's talking about. So I get my views from Mr. Franchini, or I get them from Anderson Cooper. Or Rush Limbaugh. That's not true. All my views are my own, made up from my deep and searching knowledge of all kinds of stuff.
Wow. You're really taking our mind in interesting places this episode, Charles.
Well, they need to go there because it's for lack of consideration of these things to great degree that we find ourselves where we are. Prisoners in our homes while mobs run rampant. Stop and think about that for a second. Doesn't that strike anyone as wrong? And it certainly is not what you would call an organic development. We need to think differently. Well, we don't need to. We can just go with the flow, and things will go as I predicted on several occasions. But you know, I'd rather be proved wrong